Today we're going to be talking about the farewell address. Washington talks about his retirement, but he wants to offer some advice. It is important to hear from him, but it is also important to understand who he is. So let's hear what he says about himself. When he's 24 in December 1756, he sends a letter to the Speaker of the House of the Burgesses. He is part of the Virginia militia. Actually, he's the head of the Virginia militia. And he says this to the Speaker of the House: "I have diligently sought the public welfare and have endeavored to inculcate the same principles in all that are under me. These reflections will be a cordial to my mind as long as I'm able to distinguish between good and evil." Now, there's some words in there that need some amount of explanation. To inculcate is to instill. A cordial is a pleasant memory. So that kind of explains what he was talking about then. Again, he was 22, and then a couple of years later, at age 24, during the French and Indian War, after the Battle of the Monongahela, General Braddock dies, and Washington orchestrates a retreat, and he buries Braddock in the middle of the road there and runs carts back and forth to disguise the burial place. Then he spends 3 years as head of the Virginia militia from Winchester, Virginia. The second quote I want to highlight is 19 years later, when he's 43, he writes a letter to Colonel Burwell Bassett, and he says, "I shall not be deprived of a comfort in the worst event if I retain a consciousness of having acted to the best of my judgment." Now, this quote comes at age 43, and at the Second Continental Congress, he was just unanimously elected as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army based on his performance in the French and Indian War. Now, this quote was after Bunker Hill. Then, after he's elected Commander-in-Chief, he goes to Boston. They seize Fort Ticonderoga artillery. Montgomery and Arnold are defeated at Quebec City, and Thomas Paine publishes Common Sense. And so this is early in the Revolutionary War, and these two quotes shows his character. But then more occurs. A year later, he writes a letter to John Armstrong, and he says, "To please everybody is impossible. Were I to undertake it, I should probably please nobody. If I know myself, I have no partialities. I have from the beginning, and I will to the end pursue to the best of my judgment and abilities one steady line of conduct for the good of the great whole. This will, under all circumstances, administer consolation to myself, however short I may fall of the expectations of others." So this quote shows that he is consistent all through his adult life. To put this into context, this quote was after Trenton, after Valley Forge, Saratoga, and Monmouth, but before Benedict Arnold's defection to the British on September 23, 1780. A couple of other quotes that he makes that I think also highlight his character. At age 54, he writes a letter to John Jay, and he says, "Perfection falls not to the share of mortals." Throughout the war and his presidency, he lives by this quote, and yet he is stung hard by betrayals all through his years of leadership. Later that year, there's another quote he writes to Alexander Hamilton, in which he says, "I hope I shall always possess firmness and virtue enough to maintain what I consider the most enviable of all titles, the character of an honest man." Again, this is a major theme of his own life, virtue and honesty, and it is critically important to a republic. A third letter he writes to Henry Lee that year, "Though I prize, as I ought, the good opinion of my fellow citizens, yet I know myself I would not seek or retain popularity at the expense of one social duty or moral virtue. Over the years, he observed that others would fall to popular opinion rather than stand for virtue. The right thing to do, even if you sacrifice yourself or what you want in the process, is what virtue is. So that's a glimpse into his character. That brings us to the farewell address in September 1796. Washington starts out the farewell address talking about his retirement. He states that he is not running for re-election, a third term, but is retiring, which removes any hope that he will run again and frees up other delegates to run for president. He is getting old and does not want to set up a precedent for a lifetime term like a monarch or dictatorship. He says, "I leave you with undefiled hands, an uncorrupted heart, and with ardent vows to heaven for the welfare and happiness of that country in which I and my forefathers to the third or fourth progenitor drew our first breath." He has just served 45 years of service to the country. From the beginning, during the French and Indian War from 1753 to 758 as a military man. Then from 63 to 75, he was in the House of Burgess during the acts in which Britain kept on crushing down on the colonies. And then from 75 to 83, during the American Revolution in the military he served. Then after that, 83 to 89, he was in the House of Burgess, participated in the Articles of Confederation, then was the president of the Constitutional Convention from 1787 to 89, and then president of the United States 1789 through 1797. He has seen it all. He was involved in it all. He was integral in the holding of it all together. To give additional context and perspective to his farewell address, I will be adding insights from his other writings or speeches, and then I'll also include input from other founders, such as from Washington's circular letter to the governors in June of 1783 at the end of the war, but before the Constitutional Convention or his presidency. He says this, again, 8 years trying to get these 13 colonies or states to be on the same page. It was like herding cats. So now he sends a letter to the governors and he says, "I now make it my earnest prayer that God would have you and the state over which you preside in his holy protection, that he would incline the hearts of the citizens to cultivate a spirit of subordination and obedience to the government, to entertain a brotherly affection and love for one another." Here he combines his faith, his respect for government, and his love of country. That leads us into the body of the farewell address. Now, he gives his farewell address not verbally, but in a written form, and not to Congress alone, but it is published in newspapers to the entire nation. Why would he do that? Well, it could be that it would not be filtered through any other people's biases or agendas, and it was difficult for him to talk at length, and this would have been a speech of over an hour with the difficulty of his dentures, as well as the pain involved in that. After announcing his retirement, he says, "Here perhaps I ought to stop." Well, he goes on for 50 minutes, but at least he puts the sentiment out there. And he follows that up by saying, "But a concern for your welfare, which cannot end but with my life, and the apprehension of danger natural to that concern, urge me, on an occasion like the present, to offer you to your solemn contemplation and to recommend to your frequent review." So he wants them to think about it, but to review it often. He sees many dangers of large proportions in the future based on what he has seen in the past. I want to talk about 3 areas of his farewell address: comments about the government, the spirit of party, and the place of morality and religion. I will not be talking about debt. I will not be talking about foreign relationships, but my comments will be just about those 3 areas. So let's first talk about government. He talks about the importance of unity as one people. And he says, "The unity of government, which constitutes you as one people, is also now dear to you. It is justly so, for it is a main pillar in the structure supporting your real independence, the basis of your tranquility at home and your peace abroad, of your safety, of your prosperity, and of that very liberty which you so highly prize." You will see this theme of unity over and over again because it is so crucial. Washington himself was the embodiment of unity. He gave his life to the Revolution, to the First and Second Continental Congresses, the Constitutional Convention, and the presidency. Everyone acknowledges that without him, there was no unity, even his enemies. So, as we go through this farewell speech together, you may ask yourself, was he fearful of the future of the country? And if so, why? He observed that the nation continually fell into petty jealousies as colonies, then as states, and again between military officers, both militia and continental officers, and even on his very own cabinet. Would you have had the patience and the optimism that he had? Let's listen closely to his words and try to understand his warnings and then compare them to today. Are the warnings, dangers relevant to us in 2024? Or have we progressed beyond those warnings to a better place? Let's talk about citizenship and patriotism. Washington said, "Citizens by birth or choice of a common country, that country has a right to concentrate your affections. The name of American, which belongs to you in your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride of patriotism more than any name derived from local distinctions." This is early on in his address, in which he was referring to regionalism. That is, the 13 colonies or states still had many divisions, many jealousies, and bad feelings for one another. They had been fighting each other for over 100 years, competing for the favor of England and London. Now it's North against South, Atlantic against frontier, and discord everywhere else in between those borders. 1783, his circular letter to the governors. He says some things that predates what he says in his farewell address that I think provides additional context. When he resigned as Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, and after 8 years of keeping his diverse and divided army together, he wrote this: that the people should forget their local prejudices and policies and be willing to sacrifice their individual advantages to the interest of the community. These are the pillars on which the glorious fabric of our independence and national character must be supported. Liberty is the basis, and whoever would dare to sap the foundations or overturn the structure under whatever specious pretext he may attempt will merit the bitterest execration and the severest punishments which can be inflicted by his injured country. Okay, pretty dense there. Before we try to understand the context, let's define some of his terms. Specious is false or erroneous. Pretext in this case would be a ploy. Execration is an insult or even an obscenity. It seems to me that he is pretty upset because of the words that he uses. They are strong. Liberty is on his mind, not only here, but all through his presentation. The war is over. The states more or less combined to fight a common enemy. But now that they have won, he feels that their unity and the government is in danger of evaporating because the states will return to fighting each other and they will become prey for the nations of the world. And that is what happens over the next 4 years. Of course, they don't know that when he said this, but he goes on in the context of 1783. Many other considerations might here be adduced to prove that without an entire conformity to the spirit of the Union, we cannot exist as an independent power. Well, that's pretty straightforward, but can it get worse? It does. We shall be left nearly in a state of nature, he warns, or we may find by our own unhappy experience that there is a natural and necessary progression from the extreme of anarchy to the extreme of tyranny, and that arbitrary power is most easily established on the ruins of liberty abused to licentiousness. Let's define terms. What does he mean? What do the founders mean about state of nature? A primitive state, uncivilized, uncultivated. Anarchy? Anarchy can be ideally described as a peaceful coexistence where each person does what they think is right in their own eyes, in which they are more or less a law unto themselves. But it is most often characterized and seen in history as disorder, confusion, chaos, lawlessness, mayhem. Tyranny, oppression, dictatorship, despotism, totalitarianism, autocracy. Arbitrary power, random, illogical, capricious, haphazard decision, such as King George III and Parliament were accused of making by the colonies from 1763 to 1775 when they enacted all those acts. Licentiousness, corrupt, depraved, immoral, shameless, debauched, dishonest. This is not a good place for the states and the United States to be left in. With this background, let's fast forward from the circular letter to the farewell address. He says, in this sense, it is that your unity ought to be considered as a main prop of your liberty, and that the love of liberty ought to endear you to the preservation of unity. So 13 years later, he is still tying liberty and unity together. Evidently, there's still a problem. During the ratification debates after the Constitutional Convention in 1788, he wrote a letter to the Marquis de Lafayette about tyranny. It will at least be a recommendation to the proposed Constitution that it is provided with more checks and barriers against the introduction of tyranny and those of a nature less liable to be surmounted than any government hitherto instituted among mortals hath possessed. The founders were extremely realistic and pragmatic. They tried to make it very hard for a tyrant to come to power in the United States. He went on to say, this government, the offspring of our own choice, uninfluenced and unawed, adopted upon full investigation and mature deliberation, completely free in its principles, in the distribution of its powers, uniting security with energy and containing within itself a provision for its own amendment, has a just claim to your confidence and your support. So, to flesh that out a little bit, this is how they arrived at our Constitution. It's our choice, full investigation. They thought deeply. They debated it deeply for 4 months. And when they say uninfluenced and unawed by the governments of history, how can they say that? Well, they can say that because most of those governments didn't apply to what we were trying to do here. A rule by the common person, just not the nobility or aristocracy. And they were freed from the historic principles where man did not rule himself, freed from kings, nobles, aristocrats, and rule was given to common men who were previously serfs, peasants, and the like. Then the founders inserted checks and balances within the government, a distribution of power between federal, state governments and the people, branches of government, distribution of powers, legislative, executive, judicial, uniting security with energy. Let's talk about energy. The Articles of Confederation had no energy. Congress could not compel, they could only make suggestions. It's the difference between 10 commandments and 10 suggestions. The Articles of Confederation was a mess, and Washington struggled with Congress for 8 years, and now it was time to get it right. One might say, a more perfect union. By security, they meant that each government, each branch working and staying within its own sphere, we would have security. Amendments, of course, they acknowledged they could not foresee everything and that change happens. And so they provided for change. It is the best that your representatives could come up with, the Constitution, and you should support it. I might insert here, let us not lose sight of the fact that the Constitution was the culmination of our revolution, not just against Britain, but against the historic and existing governments of the world. Governments that did not allow the common man to rule himself. As you know, our Constitution and our form of government are remarkable in the annals of history, especially since we are not bound together by one language, one ethnicity or race, one culture, or one country, and since we are not beholden to one ancient government or faith. Therefore, it is of supreme importance that we identify ourselves as Americans. We are a group of people that have agreed to come together under a constitution where the common man rules himself. It never successfully was tried before in history. And even more remarkable, given its population of over 4 million people and its large land area. It is unheard of. It is a political and governmental demarcation of huge proportions. He went on to comment about respect for our government. Respect for its authority, compliance with its laws, acquiescence in its measures, and all duties enjoined by the fundamental maxims of true liberty. Duties for whom? All American citizens and guests to this country. Again, during the ratification debate of the Constitution in 1788, he wrote this to the Marquis. The basis of our political systems is the right of the people to make and to alter their constitutions of government. But the Constitution, which at any time exists, till change by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people, is sacredly obligatory. That is, it is a sacred obligation upon us all. The very idea of the power and the right of the people to establish government presupposes that it is the duty of every individual to obey the established government. This is pretty straightforward. He recognizes the importance of this for our country. Then he wrote, the government can never be in danger of degenerating into a monarchy, an oligarchy, an aristocracy, or any other despotic or oppressive form, so long as there shall remain any virtue in the body of the people. What does that mean? He places the government on the shoulders of the people, on the virtue of we the people. That's us. The common man is responsible to uphold the Constitution. What? Not the government? What? Not political parties? What do you think? Do you read it the same way I do? Well, what did Washington, the founders and Republican form of government, mean by the virtue of the people? Well, they meant a people that were honest, truthful, were good, were righteous, were moral, were reliable, had integrity, and hard level of honor, where they put the interests of others above their own interests. Isn't that what we want from our elected representatives? Washington said this to a letter to Bushrod, Washington in 1787, a mere 6 weeks after the Constitutional Convention. The power under the Constitution will always be in the people. It is entrusted for certain defined purposes and for a certain limited period to representatives of their own choosing, and whenever it is executed contrary to their interest or not agreeable to their wishes, their servants can and undoubtedly will be recalled. He said this is the way it should work. Representatives are beholden to the vote of the people, and no other combination, no other groups, no other association or factions should they be beholden to. Then Washington talked about another danger, the spirit of branch encroachment, in which he said, the spirit of encroachment tends to consolidate the powers of all departments into one, and thus to create, whatever the form of government, a real despotism. A just estimate of the love of power and proneness to abuse it, which predominates in the human heart, is sufficient to satisfy us of the truth of this position. Although the Constitution is set up to check such urges, ambitious men can overcome them. One faction that controls all three branches of government, Congress, presidency, and judiciary. As Madison famously said, ambition must be made to counteract ambition, and that way each individual within the different branches being ambitious are a check on each other. Washington went on to say, the necessity of reciprocal checks in the exercise of political power by dividing and distributing it into different branches of responsibility and constituting each as the guardian of the public welfare against the invasion by the other branches has been demonstrated by experiments ancient and modern, some of them in our country and under our own eyes. And although we have created sufficient checks and balances between the three branches, legislative, executive, and judicial, that separation must be vigorously enforced. The framers came up with these checks and balances because one of the principles that was obvious to them from history and from our own experience was that man is susceptible to corruption. When we think that no one is watching over us, there is a strong urge, a desire within us to take what does not belong to us. Washington said, this Constitution, this government was formed to limit those urges, and it deserves our compliance, our reverential obedience. with its laws and its obligatory responsibilities and duties. It is a major support of true liberty. In the letter to the Marquis de Lafayette in 1788, between passing of the Constitution and ratification process, Washington said this: "It appears to me, then, little short of a miracle, that delegates from so many different states should unite in forming a system of national government so little liable to well-founded objections." In all of this, the founders made sure that we were a nation of laws. John Adams said, "We are a nation of laws, not of men." Washington added to that in his farewell address by saying, "Since we are a nation of laws, until the Constitution is amended by an explicit and authentic act of the whole people, it is a sacred obligation upon all of us to obey it." There's a quote by James Madison: "If men were angels, no government would be necessary." In framing a government which is to be administered by men over men, the great difficulty lies in this: you must first enable the government to control the governed, and in the next place, oblige it, the government, to control itself. Let's also take this opportunity to read a personal letter from Abigail Adams to her husband in March 1776. He was in Boston helping to craft a state constitution for Massachusetts under the Articles of Confederation. And here is what she said. "And by the way," and to John, of course, "and by the way, in the new code of laws, which I suppose it will be necessary for you to make, I desire you would remember the ladies, and be more generous and favorable to them than your ancestors. Do not put such unlimited power into the hands of the husbands. Remember, all men would be tyrants if they could. If," she goes on, "particular care and attention is not paid to the ladies, we are determined to foment a rebellion. And we will not hold ourselves bound by any laws in which we have no voice or representation." Kudos, Abigail. I would have liked to have been in the room when John Adams read that. He must have laughed riotously for a long time with tears flowing down his cheeks. Another thing he says in the welfare or farewell speech about wrongful seizure of authority. "But let there be no change by wrongful seizing of authority. For though this, in one instance, may be the instrument of good, it is the customary weapon by which free governments are destroyed. The precedent must always greatly overbalance in permanent evil any partial or transient benefit, which the use can any time yield. We have long admired our peaceful transfer of power in the United States. May it ever be so." Let us now turn our attention to factions and the spirit of party. Let us talk about misrepresenting the opinions and aims of others. One of the expedients of party to acquire influence within particular districts is to misrepresent the opinions and aims of other districts. They tend to divide from each other those who ought to be bound together by fraternal affection. To the effectiveness and permanency of your union, a government for the whole is indispensable. We are not dependent on partisan politics, but a government of the whole, where everyone benefits, and is treated equally. In Washington's letter to John Jay in 1796, he says this: "Serious misfortunes originating in misrepresentation frequently flow and spread before they can be dissipated by truth." A year before that, he wrote to Edmund Pendleton, "When one side of a story is heard and often repeated, the human mind becomes impressed with it insensibly." He talks about the obstruction of law. All obstructions to the execution of the laws, all combinations and associations under whatever plausible character, with the real design to direct, control, counteract, or awe the regular deliberation and action of the constituted authorities, are destructive of this fundamental principle and of fatal tendency. His reference to combinations and associations is a pretty wide net. It can be regions, associations, combinations of regions of the country. It can be big business or businesses with a common interest. It can be the super rich. It can be think tanks or institutions or religions, whatever combination association he's talking against. Remember that in 1796 we were still trying to figure out how a republic should function and where groups like these fit in. But the warning is against obstructions to the law, not the associations themselves, but when they step over and become obstructions. Next, we'll talk about factions that seek to replace the delegated will of the people with the will of a party. And again, party can be a group. He says, they serve to organize faction, to give it an artificial and extraordinary force, to put in the place of the delegated will of the nation the will of a party, often a small but artful and enterprising minority of the community, and, according to the alternate triumphs of different parties, to make the public administration the mirror of the ill-conceived and inappropriate projects of faction, rather than the organ of consistent and wholesome plans digested by common councils and modified by mutual interests. So what is Washington talking about? He has been observing how factions are evolving and their development of power. Partisan politics is also forming as an outgrowth of those who in 1787, 1789 favored a strong federal government, the Federalists, and those who wanted a weak federal government, the Anti-Federalists. But the wide net that he throws out is more than just partisan politics. It's just any faction that tries to influence this new fledgling government. Now he goes and talks about factions that seek to subvert or usurp the government. He says this: however, combinations or associations of the above description may now and then answer popular ends. They are likely, in the course of time and things, to become potent engines by which cunning, ambitious, and unprincipled men will be enabled to subvert the power of the people and to usurp for themselves the reins of government, destroying afterwards the very engines which have lifted them to unjust dominion. Here he sees those groups or factions seeking to subvert the will of the people through their elected representatives and enacting of that will through our government. Next, he touches the spirit of party and revenge. Let me now take a more comprehensive view and warn you in the most solemn manner against the destructive effects of the spirit of party generally. The alternate domination of one faction over another, sharpened by the spirit of revenge, natural to party dissension, which in different ages and countries has perpetuated the greatest evils, is in itself a frightful tyranny. So as we go on through his warning, it sure sounds like he's warning us of the dangers of partisan politics. By 1793, Jefferson has left his cabinet, and by 1795, Hamilton left. So in 1796, it is probable that all the seeds were there, and without Washington as president, political parties might sprout and take control. Washington continues, but this leads at length to a more formal and permanent tyranny. The disorders and miseries which result gradually incline the minds of men to seek security and peace in the absolute power of an individual. And sooner or later, the chief of some prevailing faction, more able or more fortunate than his competitors, turns this inclination to the purposes of his own elevation on the ruins of public liberty. It becomes a frightful type of oppression, as each group seeks to serve only their own interests and not the interests of the whole nation. He goes on, it serves always to distract the public councils and enfeeble the public administration. It agitates the community with ill-founded jealousies and false alarms. It kindles the animosity of one part against another, and occasionally foments riot and insurrection. He said this in his first inaugural address in 1789 that I feel is very applicable here. The blessed religion revealed in the Word of God will remain an eternal and awful monument to prove that the best institution may be abused by human depravity, and that they may even, in some instances, be made subservient to the vilest purposes. Should hereafter those incited by the lust of power and prompted by the supineness or venality of their constituents overleap the known barriers of the Constitution and violate the unalienable rights of humanity, it will only serve to show that no compact among men, however provident in its construction and sacred in its ratification, can be pronounced everlasting and inviolable. And if I may so express myself, that no wall of words, that no mound of parchment can be so formed as to stand against the sweeping torrent of boundless ambition on the one side, aided by the sapping current of corrupted morals on the other. In other words, such men are encouraged when we, the people, do nothing. When we have been lulled asleep and do not have the strength to rise up, or we do not have the moral conviction to speak out against such outrages. When we, the people, have lost our virtue. Washington says this about morality and religion. National morality cannot prevail in exclusion of religious principle. That it is substantially true that virtue or morality is a necessary spring of popular government. The rule indeed extends with more or less force to every species of free government. Morality being doing the right thing and having high ethical standards. Virtue being putting the interests of others before your own interests and serving others before yourself, which are key Republican values. He goes on. Of all the inclination and habits which lead to political prosperity, religion and morality are indispensable supports. In vain would that man claim the tribute of patriotism who should labor to undermine and sabotage these great pillars of human happiness, these firmest props of the duties of men and citizens. The mere politician, equally with the pious man, ought to respect and to cherish them. Here he ties religion and morality together as indispensable supports of both human happiness and a citizen's support for the government. His approach to other faiths throughout his leadership in the Army, his serving in the Virginia House of Burgess, and his presidency at the Constitutional Convention and as President of the United States has been consistent with this approach. They support each other, and he supports them. He goes on, and let us with caution indulge the supposition that morality can be maintained without religion. Whatever may be conceded to the influence of refined education on minds of peculiar structure, reason and experience both forbid us to expect that national morality can prevail in exclusion of religious principle. Here he ties morality to religion. He acknowledges the benefit of education and refined minds, my interpretation, but places the teaching of morality more within the sphere of religion, since it is a major focus of religion. President John Adams also said, "We have no government armed with power capable of contending with human passions unbridled by morality and religion. Avarice, ambition, revenge, or gallantry would break through the strongest cords of our Constitution as a whale goes through a net." Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. Washington concludes his comments and says adieu. This was a remarkable time in our history, and quite frankly, a remarkable time in the history of mankind. Washington's personal principles, his values and faith, and his personality were exceptional, and they were required for his leadership in the formation and the birth of our nation. In his farewell speech, he shared with us what he learned throughout his life and warned us of impending dangers to the workings of our government. He insisted on the need for unity, for brotherly affection, and for the love of one another for the success of our way of life. Out of concern for our well-being, he admonished us to respect the authority of the Constitution and our Republican form of government. Washington expressed his belief in the virtue of the people, and he warned us of the corruption of overly ambitious people who would threaten our peace and our happiness. He warned us of the misrepresentation and obstruction of factions that seek to eclipse the will of the people with the will of their party, where they will subvert the power of the people and usurp the reins of government. If left unchecked, political parties will ultimately dominate the running of the government, and a spirit of revenge will develop. Eventually, anarchy may develop where confusion and chaos reigns, and in the people's frantic search for peace and order, a charismatic person may appear that seems to be a solution to their uneasiness, and they elect them into power. But then, eventually, that person turns into a tyrant. Washington's antidote is the need for morality and religion to support virtue in the people and their representatives, which is essential for a Republican government. In 2024, we have inherited this government in all its glory and in all its shortcomings. And every American citizen should be proud of this country and be loyal to it, to be sure there's work to be done. So that's our part. With this legacy, let us unite and do it together.